if you quit learning, I think you quit living. It's always important to do so. So when Richard asked me if I'd give a talk at the youth group, I said, sure, of course I would. He kind of dropped, he didn't think that I would say yes, but I'm really glad I'm here. Now the topic that we came up with that he gave me is sin. Can you believe that? So I thought about that and I thought, sin, okay, well you guys know what sin is. I mean, you went through first reconciliation when you were little kids, and you do kind of know what it was. And I thought, well, there's got to be maybe an interesting way to present the issue of sin. And so I came up with this, and something I've actually taught before. How many of you, what's a really, really easy definition of what a sin is? I think as you get a little older, and I think you're getting there, and you'll definitely see this as you get to be adults, you start to think of sin with regard to relationships. When you're 7 years old, a sin is, I lied to my mother, I kicked the dog, I hit my brother. I hear these, believe me. They're all like things I did that were wrong, right? Think of like a 7-year-old, right? Well, as you get a little older, you start thinking about, I let my mother down. I made a promise to her that I didn't follow through on, something like that. You start thinking about, well, how did that affect her? And then you also think of sin with regard to how it affects God and how it affects your relationship with God. Now, over the years, the church, in defining sin, came up with something we call the 7 deadly sins. Have you ever heard that term? When you think of the 7 deadly sins, they are really big umbrella sins. They cover a whole variety of things. I mean, if you looked up a book and you looked up the sin of this, you would find all kinds of things listed under it. So they help you to kind of understand sin. And what I'm going to do is present these 7 sins to you, and then ask you to kind of think about what they mean to you, what they mean in your life. Pride, envy, anger, sloth, greed, gluttony, and lust. Okay, now think about all those. We're going to think about each one. Okay, let's start with the sin of pride. St. Paul says in one of his writings, he said, pride is the mother of all sins. The mother of all sins is pride. Do you know pride is the sin of Adam and Eve? It's the original sin. Adam and Eve set their will against God. God said, here's the Garden of Eden, it's wonderful, it's perfect, you can have it all. All you have to do is obey my will. And what is the first thing Adam and Eve do? They disobey God's will, right? They wanted their own will to be put forward. They were told, don't eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then the devil tempts them and says, oh, you can be like God. And that's kind of what the sin of pride is. It's kind of wanting to be God. I want my will to be the one that carries the day. So there's lots of sins of pride. And a lot of adults come to confession to me and confess that one. Just ways in which give me an example of the sin of pride in an everyday. Don't give a personal example, okay? You don't have to do that. Just say something that might exist in today's world.
Thinking you're better than going to church.
Sure, like you know better, right?
Thinking you know everything and you're smarter than everyone else.
Thinking you know everything and you're smarter than everybody else, that's right. I think, in a way, another one that comes to mind is forgetting to pray or taking prayer not too seriously. Like, I don't need to pray. Pride is always sort of just getting caught up in yourself. Okay? So that's the sin of pride. The next one is envy. Envy, jealousy might be considered the same word, right? That's one of the 10 Commandments, right? Don't covet your neighbor's goods or your neighbor's wife. What's a description of the sin of envy? No, you know what I think the real sin of envy is? Think about it this way. What if it was Christmas and you're opening your gifts, and maybe your parents really worked hard to get you your gifts, and they gave it thought, and they, picked out something that they thought would really fit you, put a lot of effort into it. And when you open the gifts, you're like, oh gee, I wanted what someone else has, or I wanted what you have, or what my neighbor got. It's really not being grateful for what you do have. That's the sin of envy. Not being grateful for what you do have. And if you look at it in the relationship with God, you say, God gave me all these gifts, and maybe I don't recognize them. but I want somebody else's gifts, but I'm not looking at mine. And I think God is saying to you, but I gave you these gifts. Why don't you use them? Why don't you be happy with them? So gratitude is kind of the problem of the sin of envy. Anger, or the more classical term is wrath. Wrath. Isn't wrath a better word? I mean, I can get angry all the time, but I don't have wrath very often, you know? What does anger do? Think about it with regard to other people. How many of you, again, don't mention any names, how many of you know people that kind of use anger as a weapon? Like their words, they can just cut you down. You know, and that's, you do? Okay, that's not uncommon. There's people that do that. Maybe they don't do it knowingly. You know, but that idea that words can really hurt. Words can be used as a weapon. And anger, which is kind of, you know, just sort of gets out of control, is kind of the opposite of what we're called to be, what we're called to be in God. Wrath is uncontrolled feelings of anger or rage. Word there is uncontrolled. Okay? And as we get older and we get more mature, we hope that our anger kind of comes into focus and we get it under control. But again, Will Rogers said, people who fly into rages always make bad landings. Do you know who Will Rogers was? How many of you know who Will Rogers was? All the old people raise their hand. Will Rogers lived in the time before World War II, 1930s. And he was what's called a humorist. A humorist. He'd be like David Letterman. Do you know David Letterman? He'd be like Jimmy Fallon today, you know. He was a humorist. He was on the radio in those days. You know, that's how you did it. And he made these little funny comments about life and things. He's the one that said things like, everybody talks about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. You know, funny things like that. But he said, people who fly into rages always make bad landings. How about greed? Or the classical term is avarice.
Like always wanting more than capacity.
Right.
If you're like spiritually, like, I want to be more rich.
Yeah, Scrooge is kind of the perfect example of the greedy person. You know, greed is wanting more than you really ever would need. And it kind of, again, relationship with God. Think of it as God gives me enough for what I need to sustain myself. He gives me everything I need. We don't need a whole lot more, right? You know, Jesus always tells us, don't be too worldly, don't be attached to worldly things, you know. Don't be greedy. That's really what Jesus was saying. So greed is a really good one there too. What is gluttony? Gluttony. That's another good one.
Indulging in like substances that
Right.
are exactly good for you.
Perfect. Indulging in something that's not good for you. And it can be very broad. People that eat too much. People that drink too much. People that use drugs. People that gambling addictions. Think of all the addictions all fall into the area of gluttony. But you can get into gluttony in things like you exercise too much. Or you can fill in the blank. And the key is the word too much is always after it, right? So there's lots of different areas where gluttony can be a sin. It's overdoing something. And the last sin is lust. What is lust? How about uncontrolled desire, usually sexual? That's what lust is. Lust is kind of a misguided, it's a sin against chastity. All of us are called to live chastely. Adam and Eve were called to live chastely. To live the proper way sexually that we're called to in our lives, at the time of our life. So lust is kind of circumventing that, or getting ahead of that. Okay, so those are the 7 deadly sins. Pride, envy, anger, sloth, greed, gluttony, and lust.